Today is the day that we celebrate the resurrection of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. But to many of us, today doesn't really seem like Easter. We have our normal Easter routines. Many of you normally today would be wearing special clothes. Some of the ladies will be sporting special Easter hats. There's certain things that we do on Easter that we can't do this year. But we're still here, celebrating together. A month ago, we were still planning to host our Easter brunch before the service, and the leadership team was looking forward to presenting the Easter story in a creative way. It's always exciting to celebrate with church family, but today, we're in our own living rooms, surrounded by only our physical family. None of us would have come up with this plan on our own, but I believe it's sometimes good to break from our normal routines and to see things through a different lens. Since our original plan for today got hijacked, I had to come up with a new message for today. So in my preparation, I decided I was going to read through the Easter story in all 4 of the Gospels, and I was going to try to piece it together in a chronological order. Now, it helped because I have actually a chronological Bible that already puts it that way for me, so I didn't have to do all the hard work on my own. But as I was reading through it chronologically, there were some things that jumped out at me, a few of them that I don't remember ever hearing. I'm sure I must have at some point, but I have forgotten them, and some things that spoke to me. And so I want to try to piece the story together today and try to get us to see the story through a different set of eyes. And hopefully, as we read through the story chronologically, it'll speak to you today too. Some of the events in the resurrection story are told in multiple Gospels. Others only appear once. But when we put them together in a continuous story, we get a better sense of what was taking place. So I've taken the liberty this morning of actually weaving those accounts together, only using one version of each story, but putting the story together from start to finish. And I'm going to actually throw out just a lot of scripture today because we're actually going to read the whole story from those various Gospels, and I'm going to give just a little bit of commentary in between, and at the end, I'm going to try to bring a couple thoughts that'll hopefully be something that we can go out rejoicing with. So I've decided to read this morning from the New Living Translation. I normally use the NIV, but because we're reading the whole thing, I like the way the New Living flows. It's a little bit more narrative. So I'm going to be reading the NLT. You can feel free to follow along in any translation that you prefer. If you're on our online app, one of the nice things is it has the Bible app built in. You can click up there, and you can have your translation right along on the side panel as you're following along with me. So we're going to start today with Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 7. This is the first thing that happened on Easter morning, other than around midnight or something, that the stone was rolled away and Jesus was resurrected. Nobody was ever really witnessed that except the guards, and how much of it they actually saw, we don't know because they fell asleep. But the first real thing that we read about on Easter morning is here in Mark chapter 16. It says, Saturday evening, when the Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went out and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. On the way, they were asking each other, who will roll away the stone from us, or for us, from the entrance of the tomb? But as they arrived, they looked up, and they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away, already been rolled away. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and the women were shocked. But the angel said, don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now, go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you before he died. Now, I just want to insert something really quickly here. If we read the stories prior to this, Jesus had told the disciples prior to his death and his resurrection what was going to happen. They didn't understand, but he told them what was going to happen. And he told them that when he was crucified, they were supposed to go to Galilee and wait for him, because when he was resurrected, he would find them there in Galilee. Now let's go to Matthew 28, verses 8 through 10. It says, the women ran quickly from the tomb. They were very frightened, but also filled with great joy. And they rushed to give the disciples the angel's message. And as they went, Jesus met them and greeted them. And they ran to him, grasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, don't be afraid. Go tell my brothers to leave for Galilee, and they will see me there. Now, this is one of the parts of the story that I didn't remember ever hearing before. I'm sure I must have. But I know the women went to the tomb and they saw the angels and they're told to go back and talk to the disciples. But I had completely forgotten this part where Jesus actually appeared to them between the tomb and the upper room where the disciples were hiding. They not only did they have the angels say Jesus is resurrected, they also physically saw Jesus on their own. And that's going to be important as we continue on today. So let's keep that in mind. Let's now go to Luke chapter 24, verses 10 and 11. It says, it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and several other women who told the apostles what had happened. So it gives us some of the women that told the story to the apostles. Sometimes I've heard people say that Mary wasn't there for that part. She had stayed behind at the tomb, but it's very clear here in Luke that she was one of the women that actually told the disciples. She saw Jesus on the way there, and she was part of the group that told the disciples, not only did the angel tell us he's been resurrected, but we actually saw him. Verse 11, after telling him, it says, but the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it. Okay, let's stop right here for a minute. There are at least 6 women who all witnessed the same thing. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and then it says several other women. So we know at least 3 others. So at least 6 women. They didn't just see the empty tomb and hear the angel of the tomb. They actually saw Jesus. And they came and they reported that all to the disciples. The tomb is empty. We saw an angel. And then we saw Jesus. But it says the men didn't believe them. In those days, women weren't viewed as reliable witnesses. They weren't allowed to testify in court because it was believed that they were too emotional and they had a tendency to exaggerate and blow things out of proportion. And I'm not going to even talk about that this morning. I don't want to get myself in trouble, okay? So let's go on. So the men, we're not sure exactly how many there were. It was the 11 apostles plus a number of other men. We know that, but it doesn't say how many. But the men essentially blew the whole thing off. They said, you women, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just daydreaming. You're imagining things. You're letting your imaginations go wild. Even though they had all of the Old Testament prophecies and the words of Jesus, which had all predicted what was going to happen, that Jesus would rise on the 3rd day, Jesus had already told them, I'm going to rise, meet me in Galilee. And now they have the testimony of these 6 women who had actually seen Jesus. They still would not believe. So now let's jump down to John chapter 20, starting at verse 1, and I'm going to skip a little bit because it repeats the story of Mary Magdalene being at the tomb. And then it jumps right into the part of them telling the disciples. And if you look at there, in between the lines, it says, Mary Magdalene found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, they have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Peter and the other disciple, who is John. It's funny how John always calls himself the other disciple or the disciple whom Jesus loved. He never refers to himself. He never says Peter and I or James and I. He always says the other disciple or something else. Peter and the other disciple, John, started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple, John, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who would reach the tomb first, John, also went in, and he saw and he believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then They went home. Now, it's not really clear here what John believed. I've heard it taught, and I've even assumed before that what it's saying is John finally believed that Jesus had been resurrected. But if we follow through the rest of the narrative, he wasn't believing that Jesus had been resurrected. He even said in his own words, though, they still didn't understand the scriptures, and they went back home. If he really believed that Jesus had been resurrected, he should have been on his way to Galilee, because that's where Jesus had told him to meet them, was in Galilee. But he went back home. I think what it's saying here is at this point, he believed what Mary had told them before they came to the tomb. Remember, the women had already said they saw Jesus. They didn't believe it. The disciples had convinced the women that they were just seeing things, that it wasn't really true. They were seeing a mirage, or they seeing an illusion. And so then Mary said, well, the body's not there. Will you at least believe that part of the story? We went there, and the stones rolled away, and the tomb's empty. And Peter and John went to see the empty tomb. And when he walked in and saw what he saw, he believed the story that Mary said, that the body had been moved, either stolen or hidden or moved to another site or something. He believed the body was missing, but he still didn't believe that Jesus had actually resurrected. And when we read the next portion of Scripture, it's obvious that even Mary Magdalene herself is doubting that Jesus has risen. Even though she heard the angels and she saw it, she's still convinced that she had only seen things because the disciples had talked her out of it. Because now it says she goes out after Peter and John leave. And in John chapter 20, verse 11, we see this. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw two white-robed angels this time, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. Now, the question we need to ask here is, why didn't she recognize him? She recognized him earlier when she saw him. Did he look different now than he did there? Not only had she spent much time with him prior to the crucifixion, she had just seen him, but now she doesn't recognize him because she had been convinced he wasn't real. He was a figment of her imagination. She's probably thinking, this really looks like Jesus, but it can't be. The disciples told me that it's not. This can't really be Jesus. So in verse 15, this man that she sees says, "Dear woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." Then she gave him his message. So this is the second time that she has seen Jesus. Now let's jump to Luke chapter 24, starting at verse 13. It says, "That same day, two of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But God kept them from recognizing him." I actually don't like the wording here in the NLT. I love the flow of the scripture, but I don't like the wording that shows here. God kept them from recognizing him. There are only a couple of translations that say God kept them from recognizing him. Most of the translations simply say something prevented them from recognizing him, or their eyes prevented them from seeing him. I really don't think that it was God that stopped them from seeing Jesus or recognizing Jesus. Now, God could have opened their eyes to see, which he will do later. God could have opened it and given them understanding at that point, but God just simply said, okay, you don't recognize, we're going to take a little time with this. We're going to let Jesus himself convince you that he is who he is, because he knows some things that a stranger wouldn't know, so we're going to have you figure it out the hard way. So we continue on. Starting at verse 17, Jesus, he asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stopped short, sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened here the last few days." "What things?" Jesus asked. "The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who would come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. Then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said the body was missing." No, that actually wasn't what they said. They said he is risen. But this is what they believe. "They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just like the women had said." Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, you find it so hard to believe all the prophets wrote in the scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer these things before entering his glory?" Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures the things concerning himself. By this time, they were nearing Emmaus, and at the end of the journey, Jesus acted as if he were going on. But they begged him, "Stay the night with us," since it was getting late. So he went home with them. And as they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. And suddenly their eyes were opened. This is when God said, "Okay, do you see it yet?" Boom. This is what's happening. Their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And at the very moment they recognized him, he disappeared. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained scriptures to us?" And within the hour, they were on their way back to Jerusalem. And there they found the 11 disciples and the others who had gathered with them, who said, "The Lord has really risen. He appeared to Peter." Now, I'm not sure exactly when Jesus appeared to Peter. This is the only part that tells us Peter had actually seen him. So by this point, Peter has seen Jesus. The 2 men on the road to Emmaus have seen Jesus. The 6 women have seen Jesus. He's already been seen by a lot of people. Then the 2 men from Emmaus, verse 35, told their story of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they had recognized him as he was breaking the bread. And just as they were talking about it, Jesus himself was suddenly standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Jesus has already been seen by all these people. The disciples, even before the men from Emmaus say they've seen him, at that point they claim to believe that Jesus has risen because they say Peter has seen him, and Peter's pretty trustworthy. If Peter says it, okay, he's not just a crazy woman, this is Peter. Now I have a question at this point. If they actually believed, then why don't they believe the part that Jesus told them? And Jesus even made it part of the message that he told the ladies, "Tell them I'm going to Galilee. They can find me there." If they actually believe like they say they believe, why are they still in the upper room? Why haven't they started for Galilee? That's where I'd be going. I'd be going to Galilee. to see Jesus for myself. They claim he's alive. They claim to believe the report that Peter gave about seeing Jesus. Now, they've heard the two men, so they have three reliable witnesses: Peter and these two other men. Verse 37. But Jesus is standing there. Jesus just interrupted them. And when they see Jesus, it says, the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. So do they believe Jesus is resurrected or not? They believe he's resurrected, but when they actually see him, they think he's a ghost. Ghosts are disembodied spirits. Ghosts are dead people. So if they think this is a ghost of Jesus, they apparently don't believe that he's really risen. Why are you frightened? Jesus asked. Why are your hearts filled with doubt? That's a great question. Why are they frightened if they really believe that Jesus has risen? Why are they frightened when Jesus is there, standing right in front of them? Why are they still having trouble believing? They should have simply believed the women because the prophets had already said it. Jesus had already said it was going to happen. They should have just believed the women. Man, when your wife tells you something, believe it. They're usually right. That women's intuition is usually right. Believe them. And this would be a great point, women, for you to put some amens there in the comments section. So Jesus, because he knows that they're still unbelieving, he says, look at my hands. Look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me and make sure that I am not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies like you see that I have. And as he spoke, he showed them his hands and feet. But still they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder, but still in disbelief. Then he asked them, do you have anything here to eat? And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it as they watched. Ghosts don't eat anything. Seeing the holes in his hands and feet and being able to touch him wasn't proof enough to them that he was really resurrected. So in another attempt to convince them that he is a real person, that he has really been resurrected, Jesus ate some food to say, here, ghosts don't eat. Now let's go to John chapter 20, verses 24 to 25. One of the disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told him, we have seen the Lord. Now, don't know how many were in the room at that time, but now we have the two men from the road to Emmaus, we have the women, we have Peter, and we have the 10 disciples at least, plus whoever else was in the house. There's now multiple witnesses who have seen it. And Thomas says, oh, you're pulling my leg. He says, I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands and put my fingers into them and place my hand into the wound in his side. So 8 days later, the disciples were together again. This time, Thomas was with them. And I want to stop here again, okay? Because now they are claiming to believe Jesus. Where did Jesus tell them to go? Galilee. Jesus wants them to go to Galilee, but they still don't really believe, or they would have been in Galilee at this point. They're still hiding in the upper room. So they believe, but they don't believe. This time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked. But suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. Peace be with you, he said. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. My Lord and my God, Thomas exclaimed. Then Jesus told him, you believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. And Finally, at least most of them, after how many times did they have to see Jesus? How many other people had to see Jesus? Finally, enough of them believed that they finally did what Jesus had commanded them to do. They finally went to Galilee. Because if we go back to Matthew chapter 28, verse 16, we read this. Then, after all this, then the 11 disciples left for Galilee, going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshiped him. But look at that next part. But some of them doubted. Even after Jesus had revealed himself, and now they're standing before him in Galilee, some of them still doubted. Why did the disciples have so much trouble believing that Jesus was alive? Even after seeing him with their own eyes, even after touching him, they still couldn't believe. Have you ever found yourself in a distressing circumstance? When the sky seems to come crashing down on you, and even though you know all the promises of God, you forget the promises because your eyes are on this situation. This wasn't supposed to happen. If God's real, I know he is, but if he's real, how could he allow this to happen? Why am I going through this? How am I going to get out of this? We feel sorry for ourselves. We become anxious and upset. We forget, even though we know, we forget the promises of God. Many of us have been caught in that trap. That's what's happening to the disciples. Even though deep down inside they know the truth, they had evidence that Jesus has risen, but they still had baggage that they were dragging along with them. Even though everything that happened had been prophesied, and Jesus himself had tried to explain those things to them, they were still holding on to their old belief system. This wasn't what they had been taught about who the Messiah would be. The Messiah was supposed to be the deliverer who would set them free from the rule of Caesar. Not only were they still under Caesar's rule, their lives were now in danger for even being associated with Jesus. It was a scary world they lived in. And fear has a tendency to cause doubt. When we're experiencing trouble, pain, grief, or sadness, it's often hard to see Jesus and to see that he is working behind the scenes in our lives. Jesus' followers were caught up in the news of the day. The buzz around town was that the body had been stolen. And so when Jesus wasn't with them, they believed when he was there, but when he wasn't there, it was easy for them to get caught up in the fake news that the body had been stolen. It was easier to believe that story than to believe the truth. Jesus has risen. After all, everybody knows that a resurrection like the one that they kept imagining was impossible. Just like it's hard for us to sometimes keep our eyes on Jesus when we're so engulfed in the news that we read on the internet and we see on TV and in our newspapers. Now, don't get me wrong. Being an informed citizen is important. And what's going on in the world is important to know. Just as the details of what happened to Jesus were vitally important. But we can get so engrossed in these things and what everybody else says that we lose sight of Jesus. Christ's desire was for each of them to see him personally. And he did everything in his power to reveal himself to them. Did you see how many times he kept coming? He had already told them what they're supposed to do before he died. He said, when I die, don't wait in Jerusalem. Go to Galilee. I'll meet you there. But they stayed in Jerusalem. So Jesus said, you know what? You're not doing what I told you to do. You're not finding me where I told you to find me, so I will come to you. Jesus wanted them to believe the report of the women. Jesus said, go tell them. But when they didn't believe, Jesus came to them. Deep down, their greatest desire was to spend time with Jesus, but their doubt and fear and preoccupation with what was going on around them kept them away from him. But because of Jesus' persistence, they did eventually have their time with Jesus. But think how much more time they could have had if their spiritual eyes had been opened sooner. If they had pushed through everything else, pushed past the doubt, pushed past the news, pushed past everything, and simply believed, they could have had so much more time with Jesus. Jesus is wanting to spend time with us too. But too often we're distracted by the business of life, the affairs of the world, doubt, fear, or any other number of things. Sometimes we can even get so busy doing good that our eyes are on the good things that we're doing, and we lose sight of Jesus. Sometimes going to church can be a distraction. It's a good thing, but it can still be a distraction. And I think one of the beautiful things that can happen this Easter, because we're not doing our regular things, if we will simply look to Jesus, I believe we can actually be blessed more this Easter, because we will actually see Him instead of just seeing all the trappings of Easter and all the traditions of Easter. Nothing wrong with most of those things. But sometimes those things get us to not actually see Jesus. It's possible that many people will celebrate Easter today, but not see Jesus. I want to close the message part of the service today by reading John 24, verse 36 again. But this time I want to read it from the NIV translation. It says, while they were still talking about this. What were they talking about? They were talking about Jesus. They were talking about all the people that had seen Jesus. While they were still talking about all those things, Jesus Himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." Jesus is with you this morning, wherever you might be. You don't have to be sitting in church this morning to experience Jesus. Jesus is with you in your living room or wherever you may be at this moment. Jesus is there with you, but do you see Him? Do you recognize Him? At this point, the disciples, even though they could see Him, still thought He was a ghost. Jesus is there. Do you see Him? Can you hear Him speaking? Peace be with you. Many of you remember the song that we used to sing. Had the words, "Open my eyes, Lord. I want to see Jesus." To reach out and touch Him and say that I love Him. Jesus is there with you this morning. Will you simply open your eyes and see Him? Will you spend time with Jesus today?